The autumn wind swept across the dusty main street of Copper Ridge, Montana Territory, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke and the promise of an early winter. It was October 1883, and the small frontier town was preparing for the harsh months ahead when a confrontation erupted that would be talked about for generations. Standing in front of Murphy's General Store, towering above everyone else at nearly 7 feet tall, was Big Jim Callahan, a man whose reputation as both a gentle giant and skilled rancher had made him a respected figure throughout the territory. His massive frame was clothed in simple work clothes, his weathered hands holding a small wooden box with obvious care. But it was the tiny figure facing him that drew every eye on the street. Sarah Beth Morrison was only 8 years old, with golden pigtails and a face that usually radiated sunshine. Today, however, her blue eyes blazed with a fury that seemed impossible for someone so small. Her tiny fists were clenched at her sides, and her voice, though high and clear, carried an accusation that cut through the afternoon air like a blade. "You gave away his gift and you took away his place," she declared, pointing a trembling finger at the giant cowboy. "Papa made that for you special and you just threw it away like it was nothing." Big Jim's weathered face crumpled with pain, and several townspeople who had gathered to watch the unusual confrontation shifted uncomfortably. Everyone in Copper Ridge knew the story behind little Sarah Beth's anger, and it was a tale that had broken more than one heart in their small community. 3 months earlier, Sarah Beth's father, Thomas Morrison, had been the finest woodcarver in 3 counties. His skilled hands could transform a simple piece of pine into works of art that brought joy to children and wonder to adults. He had been working on a special commission for Big Jim, a carved music box for the rancher's late wife's grave, when tragedy struck. A riding accident had claimed Thomas Morrison's life, leaving behind a devastated 8-year-old daughter and an unfinished music box that represented his final act of friendship. "Sarah Beth," Big Jim said softly, his deep voice gentle despite the pain evident in his eyes. "You don't understand." "I understand plenty," the little girl shot back, tears now streaming down her cheeks. "I understand that Papa worked on that music box every night after supper. I understand that he said it was going to be the most beautiful thing he ever made because Mrs. Callahan was the kindest lady in the whole territory. And I understand that you gave it to that awful woman instead of putting it where Papa wanted it to go." The awful woman in question was Victoria Sterling, the wealthy widow who had recently arrived in Copper Ridge with plans to establish the largest cattle operation in Montana. She was beautiful, sophisticated, and had set her sights on Big Jim Callahan with the determination of a woman accustomed to getting what she wanted. "She said it would look better in her parlor than on some old grave," Sarah Beth continued, her voice breaking with emotion. "She said dead people don't need pretty things. But Papa said that love doesn't die just because people do." Big Jim knelt down slowly, bringing his massive frame closer to the little girl's level. The wooden box in his hands trembled slightly as he struggled with his own emotions. "Sarah Beth, I want you to listen to me very carefully," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I made a terrible mistake. I let someone convince me to do something that went against everything I believe in, everything your papa taught me about honor and friendship." The crowd that had gathered around them grew larger, drawn by the raw emotion of the confrontation. Among them stood Victoria Sterling herself, her elegant features marred by an expression of cold displeasure as she watched her carefully laid plans unraveling in the dust of Main Street. "I don't want to listen to you anymore," Sarah Beth said, wiping her nose on her sleeve. "You were Papa's best friend and you broke your promise to him. You took away his place at your table, and you gave away the last thing he ever made." The accusation hit Big Jim like a physical blow. It was true. In his grief over losing his wife and his loneliness in the months that followed, he had allowed Victoria Sterling to manipulate him into believing that moving on meant forgetting. She had convinced him to remove Thomas Morrison's place setting from his dinner table, to pack away the memories of their friendship, and finally, to give her the music box that was meant for his wife's grave. "You're right," Big Jim said simply, and the admission sent a murmur through the crowd. "I gave away his gift and I took away his place. I dishonored the memory of the best friend I ever had, and I broke a promise to a man who never broke one to me." Sarah Beth stared at him, her anger warring with confusion at his unexpected agreement. Big Jim stood slowly and turned to face Victoria Sterling, who had pushed her way to the front of the crowd. "Victoria, I need that music box back." Victoria's perfectly composed expression cracked slightly. "Don't be ridiculous, James. We discussed this. You need to move forward, not cling to the past." "The past is what made me who I am," Big Jim replied, his voice growing stronger. "And Thomas Morrison was the best part of that past. I want the music box back, and I want it back now." "I'm afraid that's impossible," Victoria said coolly. "I've already had it shipped to my sister in San Francisco. It's gone." The lie was so obvious that several people in the crowd gasped audibly. Everyone knew that Victoria's belongings were still being moved into the grand house she had purchased on the hill overlooking town. Sarah Beth looked up at Big Jim with eyes that held a mixture of hope and skepticism. "Are you going to let her keep lying to you?" Big Jim studied Victoria's face for a long moment, seeing clearly for the first time the calculating coldness that had been hidden beneath her beauty and charm. Then he looked down at Sarah Beth, this brave little girl who had found the courage to stand up to a man 3 times her size in defense of her father's memory. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not going to let her keep lying to me." What happened next would become the stuff of legend in Copper Ridge, a story that would be told and retold around countless campfires and dinner tables for years to come. Big Jim Callahan, the gentle giant who had never raised his voice in anger, who had never used his massive size to intimidate anyone, drew himself up to his full imposing height and fixed Victoria Sterling with a stare that could have melted steel. "You have 1 hour to return that music box to me," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man who had finally remembered who he was. 1 hour, Victoria. After that, I'll come get it myself, and I don't think you'll like the conversation we have when I do." Victoria's face went pale, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "You can't threaten me, James. I have friends, influential people who—" "Lady," interrupted old Pete Murphy, the store owner, "you just threatened to keep a dead man's last gift from his little girl. I don't think you'll find many friends in this town after today." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd, and Victoria suddenly realized that her carefully cultivated image had crumbled in the space of a few minutes. The people of Copper Ridge had watched her manipulate their gentle giant, had seen her disrespect the memory of a beloved community member, and they were not pleased. 59 minutes, Big Jim said quietly, pulling out his pocket watch. Victoria Sterling turned on her heel and stalked away, her elegant skirts swirling in the dust as she headed toward her house on the hill. The crowd began to disperse, but many lingered, curious to see how this confrontation would end. Sarah Beth looked up at Big Jim with eyes that were still wary but held a glimmer of hope. "Do you really mean it? About getting Papa's music box back?" Big Jim knelt down again and gently placed his massive hand on her small shoulder. "I mean it, little one. And when I get it back, it's going exactly where your papa intended it to go, on your mama's grave where it can play her favorite song for all eternity." "And Papa's place at your table?" Big Jim's eyes filled with tears that he didn't try to hide. "Your papa's place will always be at my table, Sarah Beth. Always. And if you'd like, there could be a place for you there too." For the first time since the confrontation began, Sarah Beth Morrison smiled. It was a small smile, tentative and fragile, but it was enough to light up the entire street. "I'd like that," she whispered. "I'd like that very much." As they stood together in the dusty street, the giant cowboy and the tiny girl who had reminded him of what truly mattered, neither of them noticed that their story was just beginning. Because sometimes, it takes the courage of a child to help a grown man remember who he's supposed to be. And sometimes, the most important battles are fought not with guns or fists, but with truth and the unshakable power of love that refuses to be forgotten. 58 minutes later, Big Jim Callahan stood on the wraparound porch of Victoria Sterling's mansion, Sarah Beth Morrison's small hand tucked securely in his massive one. The house loomed before them like a monument to wealth and ambition, its pristine white columns and elaborate gingerbread trim a stark contrast to the simple, honest buildings that made up the rest of Copper Ridge. "Are you sure about this?" Sarah Beth whispered, her earlier bravado giving way to nervousness as she stared up at the imposing structure. "I'm sure," Big Jim replied, though his own heart was pounding. He had never been comfortable in fancy places, had never felt at ease among the crystal and china that filled Victoria's parlor. But today he wasn't here as a suitor or a guest. He was here as a man reclaiming his honor. The front door opened before he could knock, revealing Victoria Sterling in all her calculated splendor. She had changed into an elaborate burgundy dress that emphasized her figure, and her dark hair was arranged in perfect curls that had probably taken her maid an hour to achieve. But her beauty couldn't hide the cold fury in her green eyes. "You're early," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I said 1 hour. "I said 1 hour was your deadline," Big Jim corrected. "I never said I'd wait that long." Victoria's gaze dropped to Sarah Beth, and her expression hardened further. "I see you brought your little friend." "I brought Thomas Morrison's daughter," Big Jim said firmly. "She has every right to be here." "Does she?" Victoria stepped aside to let them enter, but her movement was reluctant. "This is a private matter between adults, James. Surely the child would be more comfortable waiting outside." "The child," Sarah Beth said with surprising dignity, "has a name. And I'm not going anywhere until I see Papa's music box." Victoria's parlor was exactly as Big Jim remembered it, all velvet and mahogany, crystal chandeliers and imported carpets. It was beautiful in its way, but it felt cold and lifeless compared to the warm simplicity of his ranch house or the cozy chaos of Thomas Morrison's workshop. "Now then," Victoria said, settling herself gracefully on a silk-upholstered settee, "let's discuss this like civilized people. James, you're clearly upset and I understand that. Grief can make us do irrational things." "The only irrational thing I did was listen to you in the first place," Big Jim replied. "Where's the music box, Victoria? As I told you, it's been shipped to—" "Don't." Big Jim's voice was quiet, but it carried a warning that made Victoria's words die in her throat. "Don't lie to me again. I've had enough lies to last a lifetime." Sarah Beth tugged on Big Jim's sleeve and pointed toward the mantelpiece. "There," she whispered. "There it is." Big Jim followed her gaze and felt his breath catch in his throat. Sitting on Victoria's marble mantelpiece, displayed like a trophy among her collection of expensive ornaments, was Thomas Morrison's final masterpiece. The music box was even more beautiful than Big Jim had remembered. Carved from a single piece of cherry wood, it depicted a garden scene with intricate flowers and vines that seemed to dance in the lamplight. The craftsmanship was exquisite, every detail perfect, every curve flowing seamlessly into the next. It was clearly the work of a master artisan, created with love and intended as a tribute to a woman who had been beloved by all who knew her. "You lied," Sarah Beth said, her voice small but steady. "You said you sent it away, but there it is." Victoria's composure finally cracked. "Fine. Yes, I kept it. It's beautiful, and I saw no reason why it should waste away in some cemetery when it could be properly appreciated." "Properly appreciated?" Big Jim's voice rose for the first time, and the windows seemed to rattle with his anger. "That music box was made for my wife's grave. It was Thomas's gift to her memory, and you turned it into a decoration for your parlor? Your wife is dead, James." Victoria snapped, her mask of civility finally falling away completely. "She's been dead for 2 years. That music box won't bring her back, and neither will clinging to the past like some lovesick schoolboy." The silence that followed was deafening. Big Jim stared at Victoria as if seeing her clearly for the first time, while Sarah Beth moved closer to his side, instinctively seeking protection from the woman's venom. "You're right," Big Jim said finally, his voice deadly calm. "My wife is dead. But her memory isn't, and neither is my love for her. And if you can't understand that, then you don't understand the first thing about love." He walked to the mantelpiece and carefully lifted the music box, cradling it in his hands like the precious treasure it was. As he wound the small key on the bottom, the first notes of "Beautiful Dreamer" filled the room, his wife's favorite song, the melody that Thomas Morrison had spent countless hours perfecting. "This," Big Jim said, his voice thick with emotion, "is what love sounds like. Not the words you whispered in my ear to make me forget, not the promises you made about our future together. This, a friend's tribute to a woman he respected, a husband's devotion that death couldn't diminish, a little girl's determination to honor her father's memory. Victoria stood abruptly, her face flushed with anger and humiliation. If you walk out that door with that music box, don't expect to come back. I won't be made a fool of by some simple rancher and his charity case. Big Jim looked down at Sarah Beth, who was gazing up at him with eyes full of trust and hope. Then he looked back at Victoria, this woman who had almost convinced him to betray everything he held dear. "Victoria," he said gently, "I was never coming back anyway." As they walked toward the door, Victoria's voice followed them, shrill with desperation. "You'll regret this, James Callahan. You'll spend the rest of your life alone, talking to ghosts and living in the past." Big Jim paused at the threshold and turned back one last time. "Maybe I will," he said. "But at least I'll be living with honor. Can you say the same?" The door closed behind them with a soft click, leaving Victoria Sterling alone in her perfect parlor with her expensive things and her bitter anger. Outside, the autumn air felt clean and fresh after the stifling atmosphere of the mansion. Big Jim and Sarah Beth walked slowly down the hill toward town, the music box cradled safely in the giant cowboy's arms. "Big Jim?" Sarah Beth said as they reached the main street. "Yes, little one? Do you think Papa would be proud of us today?" Big Jim stopped walking and knelt down so he could look directly into her eyes. "I think your Papa is very proud of you, Sarah Beth. You stood up for what was right even when it was scary. That takes real courage. What about you? Are you proud of yourself?" Big Jim considered the question seriously. "I'm proud that I finally remembered who I'm supposed to be. Your Papa was my best friend and I dishonored his memory. But today, thanks to you, I made it right." Sarah Beth smiled, and this time it was the full, radiant smile that had been missing from Copper Ridge for 3 long months. "Can we go put the music box where it belongs now?" "We can," Big Jim agreed. "And then if you'd like, we can go home and I'll set Papa's place at the table. I think it's time for supper, don't you?" As they walked toward the cemetery where Big Jim's wife lay buried beneath a simple headstone, the music box played its gentle melody, carrying on the wind like a prayer of love and remembrance. Behind them, the lights of Copper Ridge began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, and ahead of them lay the promise of a new beginning built on the foundation of an old friendship. Sometimes, it takes the courage of a child to remind us that some things are too precious to give away, and some places at our table should never be empty. And sometimes, the greatest gift we can give is not something new, but the return of something that should never have been lost in the first place.